This is Radio VR. I'm Kels Hetherington in Washington. Joining me on the telephone is Professor Linda Cardinal at the University of Ottawa. She is a political science professor there and a whiz on Canadian political issues, which are red hot with scandal these days. And with that introduction, Linda, welcome to the airwaves of Washington, D.C. and points beyond. Thanks for coming on the radio.
Hi, nice to talk to you.
Well, Linda, several years ago, there were questions after a federal election in Canada. I believe it was in 2011. And this has led to a substantial proposal to overhaul the election law in Canada. Can you talk about where that stands and what the proposal would include?
The federal election and the provincial election in Quebec are two completely different things, and they fall under different legislation. So I can talk about the federal election in Quebec, but we need to keep in mind that what happens in the provinces in terms of electoral policy is completely different from the federal level.
The scandal that was in 2011, that was at the federal level, and that is the subject at hand in the matter of this election reform bill, right?
Yeah, it is a federal election reform bill at the federal level. And the issue here is the fact that the new reform bill wants to take away some of the powers of Election Canada.
Okay. So I'm looking at a story on the CBC News site, and it says Sheila Fraser, the former Auditor General who became a virtual folk hero, to quote from the report, for exposing the sponsorship scandal, is training her sights on what she sees as a new abuse by the federal government in Canada. Tell us about the reform and why it's so controversial.
Well, Sheila Fraser is the former Auditor General, and she did major work in pulling out all the stuff around the election scandals in the years 2000. In this particular case, she came out strongly because the issue is about the power of Election Canada, the power of the agent of Election Canada, the director of Election Canada, to investigate when there are issues during elections, whether there are problems with robocalls or whether there are problems of irregularities with voters, whether there's problem in terms of identifying who can vote, who cannot vote. In the actual situation, whenever during an election campaign there is an issue, well, the director of the Election Canada can come out and say, well, there's a problem here, here's what we should do. That kind of power would be taken away from him or her. And then in the bill, there is also a disposition about the fact that the candidate for Election Canada would be under investigation for any past partisan activities. And so most of the commentators think that it's going too far. And Sheila Fraser is one of the major spokesperson on integrity in Canada. And so when she speaks, it has some effect.
Okay, so just to be clear here, Election Canada, is that a government agency?
Yes, it's a government agency at arm's length. It's a parliamentary agent. It reports to Parliament on the situation, on how the election legislation is complied with during elections, and then also it reviews the situation. Election Canada is in charge of who can vote, who cannot vote.
So if the power of Election Canada to say there's a problem in the election is taken away, what power would Election Canada have going forward?
Well, that's the whole issue.
Okay.
That's the whole issue, and that's the director of Election Canada has come out. Basically, its power is just to explain the legislation, but no longer to investigate any irregularities.
So who's behind this proposal?
Well, it's the government, the federal government, and the Minister for Democratic Reform, Mr. Poilievre.
Now, why do they want this?
Well, there's many discussions around why they want this. some commentators will tell you that they want this because they have an axe to grind. There's a match here going on, a power match going on between the government and Elections Canada, because Election Canada has been pretty tough on the Conservative Party and major irregularities during elections by the Conservative Party. A scheme called In and Out, where in your own riding you use money to perform activities or will take money from ridings for other things. And election laws in Canada are pretty strict, and you're not allowed to do this. And the Conservative Party has been able to play around with the money. And so there is in the media, most commentators say that there is a kind of a vengeance from the Conservative government towards Election Canada. And there are also needs of reform and review the legislation regularly.
Now, when you say the Conservatives, are they in Canada similar to what the Republicans are in the United States?
This kind of conservative government, yes, because there's a history of conservatism in Canada, and in political parties, when we talk about conservatives, traditionally we used to talk about the progressive conservatives. And then in the past 15, 20 years, we've seen a transformation of the Conservative Party into a more Republican-style conservatism in Canada. Of course, Republicanism is specific to the United States in terms of ideology and ideas. In Canada, we talk about conservatives because the word Republican doesn't have the same impact. We are a constitutional monarchy, so the word Republicanism doesn't have the same appeal to Canadians. But in terms of social and economic policy, there are many points in common between the Conservatives in Canada and the Republicans.
Fraser is calling the proposed reform of Election Canada basically an attack on Canadian democracy. Those are harsh words. Do you agree with what she's saying?
Well, I'd have to read her presentation. What is the consensus, though, is that most experts in Canada and even some experts from the United States have said that the election reform bill is not up to par and should be amended. That as is, it's not working.
Okay, so would you see this, as Fraser does, as an attack on Canadian democracy?
What Madame Fraser says seems to be shared by a lot of people. It is questioning the nature of electoral politics, and there is a general consensus in Canada that the bill will need to be amended. And we have seen, even though the minister has been saying that the bill is fantastic, we have seen a move towards potential changes to the bill.
But you don't side on one side or the other currently, Professor, do you? That's what you seem to be saying.
Well, I have signed a letter in the Global Mail a couple of days ago saying that it was not necessarily the best bill and that it needed to be amended.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Cardinal, for coming on the radio and talking with us about what's going on in Canada and Canadian politics.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much. That was Professor Linda Cardinal at the University of Ottawa joining us to talk about some proposed reforms in the Canadian election system. In Washington, for Radio VR, I'm Kels Hetherington. Thank you very much, Linda.